willing to sign every piece. Did you pick it up on your way out? So the way this will work is we're going to talk a little bit. Mark's going to read a little bit, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. So whatever might be burning in your brain, keep that ready for the end. But I want to start off by saying congratulations. Your book came out this week.
Last Tuesday.
Last Tuesday.
Yes.
And it's no doubt been a gauntlet ever since.
Yes.
Can you take us through the experience of launching your first book?
Oh my God. So it has been a long time that I have been trying to publish a first book, and part of like my odyssey of trying to publish my first book is sort of part of the emotional juice that fills the metaphorical journey that Paul Bunyan goes on. So my long time chasing this dream very much mirrors some of what Paul Bunyan goes through. I'm not like this fine gentleman right here, who like we went to the same college, and almost right out of college, he began chasing the arts and just went for it. And I had just so much so much admiration for like your work ethic and everything you've done with your career. I mean, I just want to say before I say anything, what an honor it is to be up here with you, Ben.
Oh, shucks.
All the admiration for him. I really look up to him and his work ethic and the way he's just got his finger in like every single pie. I mean, he does so much. So this
I'm blushing beneath my beard.
That's what we have him for. But it has been a wild thing. I mean, I would just say, like, to pick out a few things that have been particularly gratifying. One was the audiobook. And this book began as a bedtime story that I told to my children. And later, I realized it could be a work of literary fiction, and it became that in time. But I think it really lends itself to reading out loud. And the actors we got on this thing were amazing. There's multiple narrators. And I almost would say, I don't want to discourage anybody from buying a book, because please buy all the books. But also buy the audiobook, because in a way I feel like that is almost like the highest iteration of this story. And it really moved me, and I'm not a crier, but I cried so many times on my pub day, just fast forwarding to like my favorite parts and like hearing it back to me, the story that I had told so many years ago, and it became fresh for me. I mean, when you write a book, you edit it so many times that it's just kind of like you've been chewing the cud so long it doesn't have any flavor anymore, right? But then to hear it back in this fresh way was just an astonishing, unexpected experience for me on my pub day, and that was wonderful. And then the other great thing that's been so unexpected and wonderful is the way that how quickly people are reading the book. Like, people are saying, like, on a Wednesday, they'll text. I'll wake up on like last Thursday morning, and somebody had like texted me at 2 a.m. and said, I picked it up at the bookstore at 8, and I just finished it. And like, here's what I think about it. And I think the book, for a lot of reasons, it's a very entertaining story, and it began as a very entertaining story when I first told it. I put a big emphasis on books being page-turning, and there always being a cliffhanger, and you always want to keep going to the next chapter. And just to hear that people are actually reading the book extremely quickly. And then saying, the next thing that they say is like, I can't wait to tell my aunt about it, or tell my nephew about it, or what have you. It's not only are they wanting to pass it on, but they're passing it on to kind of all ages and genders. This is sort of an all ages kind of story. It's pitched as adult fiction, literary fiction, but I think it has a kind of parable and fable quality that a 13-year-old could enjoy and an 80-year-old could enjoy. So those have been some of the highlights for me.
I love to hear it. Before we get into the book and do a deep dive on it, Mark also runs a podcast you might know about, podcast/video channel called The Thoughtful Bro. And he's interviewed everybody. He's interviewed breakout authors, he's interviewed veterans in the business. Yes, let's talk more about me. I mean, does it amount to hundreds? In the end?
100 we're on like 110 something now. Yeah.
So I'm so curious about this book coming out, but you having this extraordinary education in a way through this interview series that you've run. And I'm wondering about, before we get into this book, what is a takeaway from this experience, from curating this series, for being kind of an ambassador for literature? Like, what are one or two moments that might have inspired or even informed this work?
Right. Okay. there's so much to talk about. I mean, I've talked to so many people, some of the most famous and best-selling authors in the world, and I have enjoyed it so much, and it comes from such a deep love for me. Like, I would pay to do my job. I mean, just to talk to these people is such an honor for me. And the way so one thing that I got out of it is, like, you know, when I quit my job several years ago to try to be a writer full time, it was a huge, huge thing in my life. But it's just sort of like, you don't know if you have it. You don't know if you have, like, the goods, right? And, like, are you good enough? And I had a hunch that I was, but the way I felt was like, I was like a guy, I love basketball, so I was like a guy down like at the park playing pickup ball. And I was like, I bet I can play with those NBA guys. I just think I can. And then one day, some guy comes along, he's like, hey, we got a different pickup game with all these NBA guys on Saturday mornings. You want to come down and play with us? And I'm like, this is my chance. And you go down, and I went down there, and I was like, I can play with these guys. I always knew I was good enough to kind of stand toe-to-toe with George Saunders and Jennifer Egan and Mitch Albom and all these people. And so that was just so, not only was it like gratifying for me to be able to do that and kind of trade thoughts on literature with these people, but it built a lot of confidence for me. And God, these people are just so normal. I mean, they're so famous, but they're all kind of lost in their own way and sort of confused in their own way and like articulate in their own way. And they're just such wonderful three-dimensional people when you get to know them. But I would just say, people often ask me, like, what is like the wisdom that I've learned, and what's like one thing, like you said. Honestly, the very best most interesting piece of advice actually came from George Saunders. And I asked him, like, you teach at Syracuse, so he teaches this class at Syracuse where 600 people apply to get in the class and 6 people get in, okay? I mean, that is like, it's very difficult to get into George Saunders' class at Syracuse. And I asked him, like, you know, you see all these students, you know, they're the creme de la creme, you know, what is it that tells you that an author will make it, that they will succeed and become a published author and have a career? And he said 2 things. He said, 1, a willingness to revise, and 2 is an attention to causality. Now, this may seem like, the willingness to revise, probably everybody can understand, like, you know, you have to be patient with your work and go after it again and again. But the attention to causality thing, I just thought was so particular of a comment to make. But he thinks it's like one of the top 2 things that says whether an author is going to make it. And I mean, so in case it's not clear, like an attention to causality, it's just like, look, everything has to cause the next thing. In a story, the dominoes just have to fall. There's an old saying that I've heard that, you know, if you can describe your story and the thing that connects the beats of your story can be the words, and then you're in trouble. Like, he went to the store, and then he bought some milk, and then he got back in his car. That's not a great story with great causality. But if you're connecting the beats with, in spite of that, or because of that, like, he went to the store, and because of that, he ran into his ex-wife, and in spite of that, he talked to her anyway, and because of that, she, whatever, you know. But these causal links in a story chain are kind of what keeps the reader engaged. So that's a big thing that I've always thought about.
Yeah, I love that. George Saunders, he probably has those tattooed across his knuckles,
Right.
because of, in spite of.
Yes.
So, to get nerdy for a second,
Always an invitation I like.
thinking about comics, right? If I'm writing a character like Wolverine or Batman, these are characters that have existed for 50 years, 60 years. And whenever I'm channeling that legacy, I have to think about continuity, I have to think about honoring the past, even as I try to put my own unique stamp on the present, the story I'm telling. And it occurs to me that you're doing the exact same thing with this book, you know, with Paul Bunyan, with John Henry. That you're taking these legacy characters who belong to all of us in a way, and you're trying to make them recognizable, you know, to be in conversation with that larger narrative fabric, but also put your own unique spin on it.
Yes.
So can you talk about the pressure of that, but also the way in which you went about taking these mythic figures and individualizing them for your story?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I think I was really drawn to these existing mythic figures because I think it gives a certain kind of gravitas to the work, and you don't have to completely introduce the characters, and it feels like, you know, you're sort of talking in a long tradition, which I think gives weight to the story that I like. I think the advantage for me versus someone in your situation is that there are just so many rabid fans of, like, say, a Spider-Man or a Wolverine who, like, know every single thing that happened to them. I think in the mythic folk tradition, it's first of all looser, just generally, and it's more used to kind of people just reinventing over and over and over again. But I think, and it's dangerous to say this in Minnesota, but I think the thing about Paul Bunyan is that there isn't really a story, like a story about Paul Bunyan. It's like who is Paul Bunyan? What is he known for? It's like the blue ox, he's really strong, he chops down trees, and then you just get into some of this kind of Disney stuff, like he eats 1,000 flapjacks, and his footsteps made the Great Lakes, and so on.
But that's all true.
Yeah, right. It's historical fiction. No, but he, so Bunyan, I felt completely comfortable, and I took great liberties. And you would just see right away that, like, the kind of story that I tell about Paul Bunyan, it's really an origin story for him. I mean, he ends up as a lumberjack sort of on the last page, spoiler alert, but it's like, how did he end up there? It's quite a journey that he's on. But John Henry was far more tricky, and I did feel the pressure, because I think John Henry is like a far more important cultural figure to this country. He has a story. I mean, John Henry's story is he got born, hammer in his hand as a little baby, and his mom said, "You're gonna die with that hammer in your hand." And then years later, he dies with the hammer in his hand. I mean, that is as close to a real mythic figure as we have in America, I think. It's a story about the supernatural. It's a story about a foretold fate. I mean, it's a story that, you know, Oedipus, like Oedipus or something, right? And it's a dark story. I mean, and John Henry has been used in so many ways in this country to, you know, recruit people for a draft, to represent civil rights, workers' rights, all of these kinds of things. It's a big story about race and industrialization. This is a rich, rich story that many people have told and sung and painted. And so I felt somewhat more constrained by that. But I don't want to give too much away, but, like, I think a lot of what I write about is sort of not, in this book anyway, retelling the main events that he's known for. There's some of that there, but I sort of stayed away from, like, the contest with the steam drill, for example.
The fact that you are taking not one character, but two, you know, to get back to comics, it's like a Deadpool Wolverine team up or something. Right? The fact that you have this mythic bromance going on. I'm curious how this came about. And maybe you can go back to the first germ of the novel and how it grew, because you know, you have already in Bunyan a larger than life figure. You have in John Henry a larger than life figure. The fact that you chose to weave their stories together, you know, to make this an even bigger version of the mythos we're familiar with. Can you talk about that evolution?
Oh, and there's like a super specific answer to this question. So I love myth. Some novels that I wrote previously that did not get published were a retelling of the play Medea by Euripides. I actually did rewrite Oedipus Rex. I set it in Silicon Valley. I mean, and I think this is something that's sort of missing in American literature, the real mythic figure. I think on the one side, you have cultural heroes and near mythic historical figures like George Washington and Babe Ruth and you know, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Sitting Bull, people like this, near mythic kind of people, but they definitely were real. Taylor Swift, well on her way. And then on the other side, you have comic book heroes, you know, and these are stories of the supernatural and kind of great feats of strength, but they're not, and say this with trepidation here, but, like, they're not, really, I gotta watch what I say here, but they're not serious. That's it. I actually really want to hear what you have to say about this. I think it's getting more serious and far more complex, the kind of stories that are being told in mainstream comics. But, you know, when I think of like a mythic hero, it's like, you could quote something from a story about them like at a funeral or something, right? It's like a real, like stories that are really about kind of how to live life. And I just think, like, so figures like this in other literatures are like Beowulf and Odysseus and Hercules and Arjuna and you know, Merlin and Charlemagne and people like this, right? Really on that divide between, you know, entertaining adventure lit and kind of almost spiritual literature. And that's where I want this book to be. But my favorite of all those stories, and what I believe is, for my money, the greatest story ever told, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if anybody has not read the Epic of Gilgamesh, I just could not recommend it more. It is this wonderful, entertaining tale about two friends who go around Mesopotamia and they fight monsters, and there's temptation and love and a quest for eternal life. And you could read the whole thing in about 45 minutes because it was all carved in stone. It couldn't be very long. But there's a great translation by Stephen Mitchell. He's the one you want to read because there's some very kind of wordy, old-fashioned translations. Stephen Mitchell is the one. Read it in 45 minutes. It's a wonderful story. It's witty, it's funny, still after 4,000 years. But one day, to answer your question, I thought, why can't there be a Gilgamesh in America? And Paul Bunyan is Gilgamesh, and John Henry is his friend Enkidu, and Enkidu dies, 2/3 of the way through the Epic of Gilgamesh, and John Henry, I plan to continue the story if my editor will take it and tell 2 more books of this. But John Henry's Contest with the Steam Hammer is coming, and it sort of comes at the same moment in my envisioned story as Enkidu dies in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But that is where it came from. So, and then I told it to my kids, and it was a hit. It was a runaway hit. They're like, oh my God, they still remember the story to this day. They tell me that parts of this book are different than how I told it to them back then. So I knew once it worked on my kids, I'm like, this thing, it's worked in front of a live audience. Like, this story has gas. So,
just a sort of sidebar about you were, telling the story aloud to your kids.
Yeah.
Drafting it with your kids.
Yes.
I really want to know more about that. Was that a nighttime thing? Was that waiting for the bus in the morning? Was that would they give you criticism and workshop it?
Oh my God. You really teed me
Too
up.
many adjectives?
Yeah. No, it was just, any live audiences are merciless, and the kids have no agenda. They can't hide it if they don't like it. And so, some nights they would just fall asleep. Some nights their eyes would be glued to you.
Were you improvising?
Oh, yeah.
Had you planned in advance?
What it was...
Did you go afterwards and write everything down that you just said?
So I had the germ of the story previously. I sort of knew that I wanted to write it. And so I had actually written out, before I told it to them, I had written out a kind of treatment of it, right? But then, there was just, the need for product is so high, right? It's every night there's got to be a story. So I had totally run out of other things to tell them. And so I just, one day I'm like, oh, I got this thing on my computer, I'll just try this. And so I would go to my computer and I would just find the next beat of the story. And that was tonight's kind of 5 to 10 minute. And you'll notice in this book, every chapter, if you read it aloud, is about 5 to 10 minutes. And so a few lessons that I learned from telling it to my kids, which I think are critical to my aesthetic and what I just think generally is great storytelling. One is that you can't ever take a chapter off. There's no chapter that's connective tissue, right? Or an interstitial or something, right? Every night you have to give them meat and potatoes. There has to be some big conflict, some turning point. There has to be a cliffhanger at the end. It's you just got to satisfy this thirsty audience every night. And I think I take that approach in all of my chapters, that it would serve as a satisfying bedtime story in and of itself. And then the one great story that I always tell about it is so my daughter, who was 6 at the time, every night, my daughter Aubrey, she would have this, she would hug me at the end of the story. So it's good or bad, whether I did well or not, she'd get up and just give me a big hug, right? And that was the end of the story. Aubrey has hugged me. So one night it was just terrible, and it was I was just bombing, and 2 of them were asleep, and Aubrey's just looking at me, and I just it just petered out and ended with a whimper. And so she comes up and gives me the hug as usual, and I'm hugging her. I'm like, Aubrey, tell me, what did I do wrong? What is the answer? And she's like, Dad, you just have to remember, every night somebody either has to be falling in love or fighting. and it is so if I just nerd out on that for just 1 second, it's a beautiful sentiment. It's that's my MFA, my bedtime MFA in a nutshell. But if you think about that, it's so it's either people are falling in love, so they're getting closer to each other, some relationship is improving and an alliance is forming, or there's fighting and an alliance is breaking and a relationship is breaking. And these are boiled down the 2 kind of great sources of drama,
So you have your bedtime MFA.
Yeah.
But you also have your experience as a journalist to fall back on.
Yeah.
And how did that inform the book? Was it about the clipping pace? Was it about the clean language? Was it the research involved? How did that experience at Reuters help you out?
Well, that's interesting. And I have my colleague Jeremy here who worked with me at Reuters. But I've never been asked that question before, because usually what I say when people ask me about my journalism career is that I just always say that you only have so much kind of writing juice in the tank every day, and so if you are a journalist or you have some other job in writing like ad copy, which is like so many writers have tried to make ends meet in various writing ways. But it's like, you just run out of gas. And you can't like say like, I'm gonna be a journalist for like 7-8 hours a day and then come home and like also write this creative thing. It's just, the juice just gets bled out. And so it was really a turning point in my career when I was about like in my early 30s, where I stopped being a journalist and I took a different job. And that's when I started writing novels, like with real ambition, and I had juice left for it. But I would just say that like, I do believe in certain things about journalism appear here, which is pace, clarity, accessibility. Like I've had people, an early version of this was a friend of mine read it to his 10-year-old daughter, right? And then another friend of mine recently gave it to their 96-year-old grandfather. And like, this to me is like, those two things is like the greatest compliment. It's like any human being who can read can understand this story. And I just think, just because something is told in an accessible, entertaining style doesn't mean that there aren't serious ideas in it. Because like all my big, most serious ideas about race and class in America and indigenous conquest and capitalism, they're all in here. But they're just told in a way that like an 11-year-old can understand, you know?
And that's a really rare thing, to find that balance. I often talk about true grit in that way, saying, you know, you can hand this to anybody. You can give it to a 96-year-old, you can give it to a 10-year-old, and they'll equally enjoy it.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
cheers to that, Bunyan
sure.
and Henry.
Yeah.
I want to talk about tone, but before we talk about tone, I think it's important that people hear it firsthand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you share a few pages with us?
I will. I'll just share like a very brief reading from the top, and I just like want to make one comment about it, just so you guys can understand a little bit where I'm coming from, and see how this is emotional autobiography. So just let me just introduce this for a second. Like, so I just believe all great myth and all great fantasy is really emotional autobiography. So like, for example, I think Lord of the Rings, despite what J.R. Tolkien swears to, it's just really him working through his feelings about World War I. It's like, he was called from his bucolic, idyllic life in England and brought onto the continent in this terrible quest for power. I mean, that is just the story of the Lord of the Rings. I think George Lucas, when he was writing Star Wars, so George Lucas's father owned a stationery store in Southern California, and he wanted George to work at the stationery store and not go to film school, which seemed like a terrible idea to his father. So I always think when like you see Vader in Empire Strikes Back on the bridge saying like, "Come, Luke, we'll rule the Empire together," it's really just his dad being like, "Luke, come work at the stationery store." And Luke is like, "Never," and I'd rather die. And that's just George goes to film school. And I think in this book it's the exact same thing. So I, in 30 seconds or less, I, tried to write in my 30s, and I was so empty inside, and I had always wanted to be a writer, but I had gotten to a very dark, dark place. And I think this is something that a lot of people in the middle of their life go through, where they think, where did I leave that spark that I had so long ago when I had these dreams of being a great writer, or whatever your dream may be. And then it would even get darker than that, and you start to think like, if I really had any talent, if this was ever going to happen, it just would have happened by now, right? I mean, there's so many people out there who succeed in their 20s and 30s, and I'm 40 years old, and it's just never happened for me. But I took the plunge, and very much at the encouragement of my wife, who thought I should have done it years before, but I finally quit my job and just did this. And it at first went completely terribly. And I had a few projects in the work, and they went off the rails. And a year after I left my job, I was in a far worse place than I had been. But right at that moment of kind of staring into the abyss, that's when I started writing this book, because it came from a place of me being just completely at the end of my wits and thinking I had like squandered a good career and was never going to make it as a writer. And I had that moment where I could have chosen to go back to my old career, and I just sort of stuck to my guns, and I'm like, F this, I'm gonna do it. And that's when I started writing this book. So, knowing all that, I just want you to hear like the first couple pages of the book and just see if you can see how this is sort of my story. Okay, prologue, the Chilali. When Paul Bunyan was a young boy on the vast, windswept plains of America, his mother told him stories about a magical creature called a Chilali. The Chilali, Sue Bunyan said, was a tall, handsome, and somewhat mischievous being that lived in the woods. They had the voice of a human, great brown wings like an eagle's, and the spotted legs of a jaguar. According to Sue, the Chilali always arrived at a particular moment in a person's life. The Chilali loves someone at a crossroads, so Sue said. The moment when a person can shy away from change or walk the twisty path to the beautiful destiny. Year after year, as winter gales rattled the windows of their log cabin, or on lazy summer days when the sun baked the open prairies, Sue told her son these strange, entertaining tales. And Chilali stories were quite entertaining. They all had one quality in common. In order to follow the Chilali's advice, the hero had to change their life in the most shocking of ways. In one of Paul's favorite stories, a baseball player had to intentionally strike out to win the girl that he loved. In another, a businessman had to live the life of a beggar to save his dying brother. When telling the stories, Sue delighted in making the characters knock on all the wrong doors before the right one opened, tying themselves in terrible knots before at last they got untangled. The twisty path was never obvious, nor safe, nor straightforward. It involved delays, backtracking, and confusion. Sue told her son other tales too, of Noah, Moses, and Jesus, of Hercules, Odysseus, and Beowulf, of fantastical dwarves and terrible trolls and benevolent wizards. But in the end, it was the stories about the Chilalis that young Paul loved most. And the boy became certain that one day he would meet a Chilali himself.
Yes. Bravo. And here you are with the beautiful destiny before you.
I mean, that's the idea.
This book works so well because of tone, for me. The language sells it. And I think what you've done here is built a heightened reality with heightened prose, with prose that feels mythic, that feels like the voice of a fable, a tall tale. And that's really hard to do. How did you get there? Did it flow naturally from the very beginning? Or was this something where you were molding it along the way, or looking to other authors? I was thinking of Marquez at times, I was thinking of Twain and others.
Yeah, I think it's very hard. And I mean, I guess in some ways the jury is out about, you can all decide whether you think the tone works. I mean, you think it works, and that's a great compliment to me. But it was really hard because I'm sort of threading the needle here. On the one side, you have kind of a more cartoonish, childish kind of storytelling that would have been probably some of the nights when I was telling the stories to my kids. It just really gets blown up and outlandish and everything. And then on the other side, actually, when we sent this book out to try to find a publisher, some of the feedback we got was like, could you make this more realistic? I mean, I think kind of realism is the dominant mode of high art and literary fiction, and has been for the last 50 years, maybe 100 years, maybe more. I think that's changing now. I mean, I think people are really starting to see in speculative fiction, the kind of stuff that we write, that this is where some of the real art is. But people just kind of wanted, could it be grittier? Could there be no magic elements in it? And so I had to kind of always go down the middle here, and like here's the kind of woo-woo thing that I will say about this and the tone of this book. To me, a purely realistic representation of reality, which just kind of assumes that we are all atoms vibrating, and we're all just sort of like kind of electric currents and all what science can prove. This is not actually reality, because to me, the experience of living life feels mythic. And the feeling that I have about what it's like to be alive is the kind of feeling that you will find in this book. And I actually think that thinking of oneself in a mythic way as a hero on a kind of journey is actually a quite healthy way to think. And it works for me. And this idea of following the twisty path towards the beautiful destiny is something that I feel like everybody has in their own life. And when I hear people talk about the changes they want to make in their own life, or the goals that they've been striving towards and either they got to or didn't get to, I just feel like this kind of pattern of kind of abandoning the straight road to profit or predictable results and embarking upon a different kind of journey along this twisty, unpredictable path towards this kind of higher, more poetic way of life, that is just what life feels like to me. And so to me, this is realism, if that makes sense.
It does, I love that. We've been talking about the hero's journey, and the audience aligning with it. And to bring it back to comics for just a second, I also want to talk about the villains in the story, the principal villain. In comics, we oftentimes say that the best villains are either an opposite or a dark mirror of the hero. Examples of this, Superman, his opposite is Lex Luthor, or Bizarro. His dark mirror is Zod, the Kryptonian, who has the same power set, but uses it for ill intent. A more literary example, think of Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. Right, Moriarty is a dark mirror of Sherlock Holmes. He has the same skill set, but it's a bad dude.
Yeah.
I want you to talk a little bit about the villain in this story, how you don't just create propulsive plot with this character, but how you create somebody who is, a magnetic force that your main character can sort of realize something about themselves through. Because that's the thing that villains oftentimes provide an opportunity for is, some sort of internal fissure in the hero, some sort of internal weakness is overcome through this physical altercation with the antagonist.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, another word that's sometimes used for it is a shadow, right? I mean, it's, and I think that, all those terms that you use in the shadow term, it's like in the antagonist, there is a repressed part of the protagonist, or a part of the protagonist that they don't want to admit is really there. And when you see these two, all these great kind of pairings that you talk about, locked in a struggle, and suddenly you just you think this is really the same person. They're just kind of on different sides for the moment. And yeah, the villain in my book is named El Bafo, and he is this kind of wild, charismatic, kind of carnival barking Yankee peddler capitalist. And one thing that I'll say about what influenced him, and Bunyan begins working in a mining town called Lumptown. And he's mining this kind of miracle, highly toxic, highly pollutive substance called lump. But it also has these magical properties when it's processed. And so El Bafo wants to be on the kind of the money-making side of this processing, even though it's polluting the world. And so one thing about El Bafo is I worked on Wall Street with my friend Jeremy here, and we covered these guys. And it's some people have said to me, people who I think who aren't as familiar with Wall Street types, they're like, oh, this character is so over the top. But when people who have been on Wall Street read this book, they're like, yep, you got it. If you get into the back room of the back room, which is I have had the misfortune or fortune of being in, this is actually how these folks sound. I mean, Elon Musk puts it out for everybody to see now, and so you can it's not actually hidden in the back room anymore. This kind of world saving, I want the world to be saved, but only if I can save it, that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of my experience in the business world and the financial world that kind of clued me into how a capitalist like him would really think and talk. But I do think that neither Bunyan nor El Bafo is kind of complete as they are. And one of the great things that happened to me in this process is I became friends with a guy named Matthew Quick. So Matthew Quick wrote Silver Linings Playbook. Wonderful, wonderful guy, great writer, and he's really just been kind of a mentor for me throughout this. But one of the great things he did is he published a review, or not a review, but an interview with me, but it effectively was a review because all his questions were 3 paragraphs long, and it was him telling me about what he thought of my book, and then he would ask me to answer it. But he went on this whole thing about El Bafo and Bunyan, and just how only in the kind of neither one of them possesses the whole truth, and only when they kind of see each other, kind of can the truth really be glimpsed? Because I think Bunyan is very idealistic, and ultimately he's heroic, and ultimately my sympathies lie with him and his quest for the beautiful destiny. But El Bafo also has a point, and just in the way that Elon Musk has a point, much as some people might be loath to admit it, there is some good, great good. I mean, the standard of living, thanks to fossil fuel and extractive capitalism, the standard of living for humanity has risen astronomically in the last 100 years. And we're in a kind of devil's bargain right now, and this book is about that devil's bargain. It's how much we are accelerating the raising of the standard of living while also destroying the future of the planet. And I think nobody really knows how to get off this ride. And that kind of paradox is at the heart of the conflict between Bunyan and El Bafo.
And I have one more question. I just want to cue the audience up though and have, have your burning questions at the ready before we get into this. With speculative fiction, with science fiction, with fantasy, with horror, with this book, oftentimes the stories that capture our imaginations most, that feel most relevant, that last, are the ones that are really channeling cultural unease, political unease. And you've been flirting with this in your answers all along, but just to lean into it a little bit more fully, how do you take something old, as you've done here, and make it relevant to the right now? And there's a polemical sort of heart that's beating very loudly in this when it comes to some of the things you've already mentioned, whether it's a racist prison system, whether it's, industrial maladies, environmental maladies. You're talking about the swelling divide between the 1% and the rest of us, and on and on. This is a fable that sort of slaps you across the face with, it's very important messaging as well. And you talk about how you're delivering that and the importance of delivering that through the narrative.
Yeah, man, that's another great compliment. Man, you're gonna make me cry up here. Thank you for saying that, and it's something I try so hard because I feel so strongly about so many of the issues in this book, about the environment and about capitalism, indigenous conquest, and the kind of the soul of America. I mean, America, a country that I just love so much. I love America so much, and I think this is a time of real despair and conflict in this country. But I just believe in America so much, and I think this book is just very hopeful about America. Sorry, I lost my thread for a second. What was the question again?
It's making
the political statement. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. But here's the thing. If you engage people right on the level of the polemic, they are just going to immediately tune out, right? If you just say I'm against fossil fuels, everybody knows what they think, and I could bring up a lot of topics that I'm sure everybody here can imagine what topics I'd bring up right now that everybody would immediately think, not only do I already know what I think about this and don't want to hear anything else, but I'm going to also judge you, and I already know what you're all about now because of the way you brought it up, right? And so we've just come to this great impasse where I passionately feel about these different issues, but I just don't have any way to engage anybody on it. And so if you kind of come at it a little bit of a backdoor way, a kind of childish way almost, and you're just hey, I'm just telling the story, and well, this guy does this, and this guy does this, and then you're sort of caught up in the adventure of it, right? And then all of a sudden, you see the cost of a certain way of thinking. You see the cost of a way that we behave now as a civilization, and then all of a sudden you just pull back and you're wait a minute, oh my God, that's how it looks, kind of when you turn it like that. So I feel a lot of passion, but I don't find ways to really connect with people about these important issues of our time, and this is sort of my prayer that some of these things, and I really want people to understand, the book is not a polemical in the sense that it has it really comes down on one side. I mean, I have a great friend, one of my best friends in the world. I met my wife at his wedding, Massachusetts guy where I live, and he moved to Houston to live with his wife, and he took a job in the oil and gas business because that's the job that was available. He spent 20 years in the oil and gas business, and so he knows how the oil and gas business thinks down in Houston. And he loved this book, and that was a great thing, but he's if I gave this to my boss, he'd never finish it, right? He would just think this is just an attack on the fossil fuel industry. But my friend who doesn't have that same, because he says fossil fuel people are extremely defensive actually, right? Because they feel like they're doing good work that's raising everybody's standard of living, but they just are the villain of our society right now, right? And I think in this book, and what I hope in this book, and what my friend saw in this book is that actually it's a far more complex, nuanced position. But telling this kind of fable story is sort of the only way that I can begin that conversation.
Yeah, I should say that as with Atwood, there's a way of being political without being polemical.
Thank you. There you go.
You've succeeded.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Thanks, man.
And let's open it up to the crew. Let's hear from you. What questions do you have for Mark?
What does your writing routine look like?
So my writing routine is I'm married and I have 4 kids, And the way my wife and I have just kind of worked it out is I have the morning to myself. And so I can just wake up whenever I want and just go down and start writing. And she will get the kids off to school and so on. And then her job is sort of more demanding throughout the day and often into the evening. So that's when kind of at like 2 or 3 when the kids get home, that's when I pick things up. So I just have this amazing amount of time, and like believe me, like I lived so long without having this much free time that like it's very actually easy for me to motivate myself, because all I have to do is think about what it was like for 20 years of my life waking up to do a job that I didn't want to do. And I'm just so grateful kind of every day for this opportunity. And so on top, the other thing I'll say about it is like I really love writing. And so like for me, it's like a lot of people think it's say, and so many writer friends of mine, it's like hard to get to the desk, and you know, they love having written, but they don't like the writing, but I really just enjoy writing. So to me, it's just this like wonderful part of the day that I'm so grateful for, and it's only really been about in the last 5 years that I've had that, but yeah.
Other questions from the gang?
Mark, have you sat down with your children now and read this one cover to cover with them?
I haven't, but like my 10-year-old is actually reading it now, and he's like gotten the furthest. He's about like 10 chapters in. But they know, they've like heard about, like I said, little bits and drafts of it, and they're like, oh, like that's not how it happened. But the big answer to your question is like I can't even tell you how like unimportant my realization of my dreams are to like my 4 kids. I mean, it's just like my daughter. I was in New York. It's like this beautiful event. It's like one of the best nights of my life. Like all these people I used to know when I lived in New York, they all came out. It was like a week ago, and like she's calling me the whole time I'm like talking to the interviewer. She's like buzzing my phone. I have to put it away, right? So finally she calls me again, like the moment it's over. And so finally I pick up, like thinking it's some kind of emergency. And I'm like, hey, Aubrey, I'm at this reading in New York City. And she's like, Dad, you kept Ronan's lacrosse bag in your car, and now he can't go to lacrosse practice. And I'm just like, okay. I'm like, but I'm at my reading in New York. She's like, well, what about Ronan's lacrosse? So that's about how important my life appears to my kids. Yeah.
Who was the biggest asshole we covered? No, I'm just
I want to hear the answer.
too many to count. I'm curious what interests you in sort of retelling stories that already been told.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is that, so quite crassly, I would just say that it's like very reassuring to pick up a story that has lasted 4,000 years, right, and is still being read, right? You sort of know that they're doing something right, you know, and like so that's why I was always rewriting, you know, the Greeks, because I just felt like that I can't go that far wrong rewriting these masterpieces. But yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to write a story like this, but I felt like if I just made up a figure of some kind named like, you know, John Smith, right, or whatever, just picking names out of a hat, and he was similar to this character, and he went on this kind of odyssey with the Chalali and the beautiful destiny. It's like I certainly wouldn't be here because like I've got like so many tour dates in Minnesota because they love Bunyan, right? And Maine and Minnesota are writing articles about me, and no other states. But you go in with a built-in audience in a way, and I feel like, again, like I said earlier, I mean, I don't know how this guy does it. I mean, you just kind of have to like be extremely creative and give people something new while also like obeying like 1,047 different biographical points that are in Spider-Man's past or what have you.
And surviving the Twitter trolls.
And surviving the Twitter troll, right? Yeah.
Mark, can you talk about your publication process? Did your agent just send it out and it got snapped up immediately?
No, I wouldn't say that. It did get bought on the first round, but okay, if you really want to go inside baseball, I'll just go quickly through this. There were some like, kind of interesting parts about my publication process. So, you know, there was only one editor in the first round that was interested, who is the editor who ultimately got it. But what she said was, she was like, it was sort of what's called like an R&R, like revise and resubmit. She was like, the book is too long. And it, like there was like a book within a book at one point. I mean, the book was 130,000 words when it went on sub. Right now it's about 96,000 words. So that's like, you know, almost like 40% of the book has been taken off or whatever. So it was way too long. It had this book within a book. And she's like, if Mark is willing to revise these things, like I want to take another look. But the letter she wrote was so beautiful, because the thing about my editor, and she's so great, is that there were certain things about this book, like the Chilali, and this light that Bunyan sees, this like sort of a path through the world called the gleam, and he kind of sees it as an aura around people, and it's like a clue to kind of the twisty path to the beautiful destiny. But at first he thinks it's proof that he's crazy, and that something wrong with him. But then he learns from the Chilali that this is actually his greatest strength, and if he actually had the courage to kind of follow this gleam, he would arrive somewhere that he's meant to be. Those are the things that Anna, my editor, was like, sort of like, not like, here's mainstream literature, here's where your book is. She wasn't like, can you just bring it a little bit closer to the mainstream? She was like, can we just double down and go way out here? You know, all the things that I thought were so idiosyncratic about the work, and so just me. She was like, that's what I loved most. So can you do more of that? And so that established a great deal of trust. And then the other interesting part of the story is that that trust was essential when 3 months before I was supposed to, we had to have the final edits in, about a year ago. She just was going through one final edit, and she was like, you know, Mark, I just want to say, don't kill me, but the ending doesn't work. And I was like, the ending? And what she meant was like, from like this point on, which is like the last like 70 pages of the book, she was like, it's just not fresh. I've always felt this way. I didn't want to say it. I felt so bad about saying it, but I just got to let you know that I think it doesn't work, and I think it's stale. And because of that trust that we had established, and because I hold her in just such high regard, I was willing to like really consider that, and I knew deep down that she was right, because I had also been in denial about it. I think the ending was stale, but I didn't know how to fix it. But when she said it, I was like, okay, I gotta fix it. And so we just went through this whole process. It was like sort of the clock was ticking down, and it's like, are you gonna rewrite the last 70 pages of your book in like 2.5 months? And finally, I mean, there's a whole other dramatic story about kind of like all the different things I tried and whatever, but I finally hit the answer. And what I would just say to you about hitting the answer in a story that is not working is one of the most satisfying things in life. I mean, it is like the engine just roars to life all of a sudden. And then from there, the language follows, the pace follows, everything follows. When you have the story right, you can rewrite the last 70 pages in 2 months, no problem. It took you 4 years to write your whole book till then. When it clicks, it's like it's just given to you, and you're just almost like reciting a gift that was given to you, and that is what happened. And I just think, the last thing I'll say is I feel like I've written a lot of other books that didn't get published, so I say this with some authority about my own work, but this to me is an A+ book. This is as good a book as I can possibly write. And I've written other books that are like A-, B+, and the difference between like a B+ book and an A+ book is like the difference between like, you know, LeBron James and like a great college player, right? That great college player is really great, but LeBron James is the best, and there's really no comparison. And I just think that one tweak from my editor made this book, and I'm so grateful.
It's hard to find those editors.
My God.
Send her some chocolates and wine.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
How did those earlier books inform this book? Or, put another way, what did you learn or not to do or to do that made this work?
Oh God, I mean, so many things. I think I have this in common with every artist, that you begin writing derivative work, you write work that is, I'm trying to say something new about this, because this is just, everybody says this, that you kind of go through an apprentice phase, and you write like the people you admire most. And for me, that's like Homer and Tolstoy. And I was just like, I mean, the first book I wrote, Jeremy and I were just talking about at dinner, I wrote a book about Crazy Horse and Custer, which was supposed to be like the American War and Peace. It's like the most terrible book of all time. It's like, it was so misguided and sprawling and overly ambitious, but you just imitate the people that you like, right? But I think the key thing, all right, here's like the one new fresh thing I can say about this. Often people read great writers, like so you read Tolstoy, and it's so overwhelming, like the feelings that he gives you, and you're just feeling all these Tolstoy-ish things that he wants you to feel. And then you take those feelings that are now stored up in you, and then you try to put those feelings into your work. And so what you get is a kind of like bastardized Tolstoy feeling, right? What this book is sort of like the first time that it's like my feelings in this book. Like when you read this, you'll feel like, I hope, like what it feels like to be me. real dividing point of like this book and how it's so different from all those other books is that it finally wasn't just recycling other people's feelings, and it was really putting my own in.
And when did you realize that? At what point did you realize this was different in that way?
Oh God, it was just so generative. I mean, it was so abundant. Like I thought that I could make this trilogy project into like one thing, but it just, more and more characters, more and more, I mean, I was just so free. I was so free. And it was unlike anything I'd ever read, unlike anything I'd ever written, and this is gonna sound so stupid, it just made me happy, you know? And the other things they felt like work. So I don't know, if that's encouraging to anybody who's trying to write something, I don't even, it seems so inarticulate, but I think you just have to go through that recycling of other people's feelings for so long until you start being able to express your own feelings.
I kind of want a t-shirt that says Tolstoyish feelings. Sounds like from our bookseller, we have time for one more question.
No pressure.
No.
So you said there's gonna be another one?
I was about to say the same.
Yeah,
Give
but
us a
I,
teaser
more.
here.
Yeah.
Shared universe now.
right. So the big thing is my grand project. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Again, another plug for the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a wonderfully structured three-act kind of drama, and I think it breaks down into three different areas of human experience, which to me are the three main areas of human experience that I want to discuss. So this book is about personal destiny. It's about the question like, what should a person do with their life and their time? The second book, which corresponds to the second act of Gilgamesh, is about love, and it's about family, relationships, sex, temptation, romance, children, these kinds of things. And then the third book will be about mortality and the afterlife and what does it mean to live. And there is a quest for eternal life in Gilgamesh, and it will be in my book as well. And just what does it mean to live life when you realize finally that you're really going to die, and the effect that has on people and how people work through that. So those to me, kind of personal destiny, love, and mortality to me are like three just grand topics that I feel like I would love to talk about, and I think there's a great story that I can weave through it. So I have turned over the first 150 pages of book 2 to my editor like a couple weeks ago, so fingers crossed that she'll pick up that book, and maybe I gave her a one-page summary of the third book, and so maybe I'll get a 2-book deal, who knows, but that's what I'm really hoping for.
Does it have a working title yet?
So the working title is I Am John Henry, and I don't know if that'll stick or they'll try to do something more like this, but it's more focused on John Henry and his odyssey and his fate. So yes.
Sounds like the mortality book isn't one you're going to read aloud to the kids at
it's a funny question, but I just
Leave
think
them
like,
with existential terror.
but I would want, the challenge of that book is to find a way that like I could talk to my children about those issues in my own way and come to terms with it in a way that is like not scary and that is hopeful, even though these are scary topics. Like that's my job.
Yeah.
I want to make it something that it would even be a pleasure to read and fill them with a sense of like awe and mystery.
And that's the Death of John Henry book.
No, that's like the final book about mortality. Yeah, but yeah, so I've got to find a way to make that. I have a little bit of a downbeat, sort of like Empire Strikes Back, but yeah.
All right, well, let's give Mark a hand.
Thank you, everybody.
Mark's going to be signing books at the front